Welcome to the second day of the 7th World Socialist Forum held here in Beijing. I should introduce myself very briefly. My name is Ranjeet Brar. I'm from Britain. I'm in the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you to our Chinese hosts, as ever, from CAS, the Chinese Association of Social Studies, for hosting this event. As you know, yesterday we had a great plenary session. It was very interesting to hear many of your contributions. And today we are broken up into smaller sessions, and this is Group 4. And I hope in my role to facilitate as many of you to come and give your presentations as possible. And any other comrades? That's great. Okay, so in that case, I will just to get my presentation out of the way, I'll give my brief contribution. And then if anyone wants to comment, then we'll move on. Okay? Okay, thank you, comrades. So again, my name's Ranjeet. I'm from the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. We're a very small party operating in what is perhaps the oldest imperialist country in the world. And there is perhaps a historic debt owed by the British working class to working and toiling masses of all countries, which we are very far from fulfilling. But there are good reasons for this. Our country has an old, experienced ruling class that has a very firm grip on the minds of the working people and has long ago made its own opposition movement. So if imperialism came to England maybe 150 years ago, 100 years ago, Cecil Rhodes, a very famous British imperialist who also had a role in the colonization of South Africa, famously came back to England around the turn of the century, and he saw riots in the streets from classically deprived industrial working class. And he said to his fellow rulers in Parliament that the way out of this is imperialism. He said, we must exploit workers from all over the world. We must extract value, surplus value, super exploitation, if you like, from other countries, and bring that home to buy off our working class. And this phenomenon that Lenin described and grappled with of imperialism is a very real phenomenon, not only for Britain now, but for most of Europe, America, perhaps Japan to an extent, but many advanced industrial countries provide a better standard of life for their workers on the basis of exploitation not only of their own domestic working class but workers throughout the world. And we have a long history in our country of a social democratic movement, by which I mean, if you like, an acceptable opposition that form a loyal part of the government, and in our country that's the Labour Party. They have over 100 years of history of seeming to be a workerist party representing workers in Parliament, but never threatening the status quo of the British establishment and ruling class. Despite that, the salvos of the October Revolution in 1917 had a profound and electrifying effect on our working class movement. As I think you all know, and I've listened to your presentations yesterday, they had on all of your countries and on the world. So in the wake of October and the successful revolution there, communist parties came to exist all over the world. In India, where my father comes from and many immigrants in England come from, a communist movement arose, and we look to a figure there called Bhagat Singh, but equally in China, in Italy, in whichever country I name, in southern Africa, throughout the Africa, Asia, Latin America, the salvos of the October Revolution awakened the proletariat and toiling masses to the possibility that capitalism wasn't the end, colonialism wasn't going to be their final lot, that liberation was possible and mankind could walk upright on a new and independent and sound footing. The communist movement in my country became quite large for a time. But then it started to decline, as it did in many of your countries, and again I saw that in the presentations that we're giving yesterday. It was telling, I think, of the effect that the collapse of the Soviet Union had on the communist movement as the culmination of that process. to hear my Italian comrades say that in 1991 they had a party of 1.8 million members, which must have made it one of the largest communist parties in the world and certainly in Europe. And yet their response to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to dissolve their party, to simply surrender. And clearly, if the Soviet Union had 20 million members of the Communist Party at that time, not that far behind the impressive 80 million that our Chinese comrades have today, they also were unable to stop the defeat of socialism in their country with the profound effect that had on our movement. What's also clear to me is that our movement hasn't yet fully reckoned with that blow. Many comrades said there is an upsurge in the socialist movement worldwide at the moment, and I feel that to be true from the atmosphere in my own country and throughout the world. And that is really because of the profound economic crisis that capitalist imperialism finds itself in today. In our party's analysis, that crisis is as profound as the crisis of the 1930s, which ushered in such profound changes throughout the world, not least of which was the Second World War, but also following that a wave of revolutions in Eastern Europe and obviously China, Asia, Latin America, Africa, throughout the world. But our movement has not yet been able to offer that firm leadership, certainly in our country, but around the world. And a part of that is our failure to reckon with how our movement moved from being able to smash Nazi fascism, an emerging triumph from the Second World War, and having unprecedented prestige worldwide, to the point of collapse and capitulation, apparently without firing a shot of the Soviet Union. I'm going to give very briefly, our party's take on why that is as a contribution to the discussion, and I hope some of your comrades will find it interesting. And I have some copies of it in more detail for anyone who is interested in taking it and finding more out about it. There were political and economic reasons, and we date these primarily to the period of the death of Stalin, the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, when Khrushchev gave his secret speech, a speech which of course was secret to the people of the Soviet Union, but was broadcast widely around the rest of the world in the imperialist media at the 20th Congress. In that speech, he began a number of political transitions, which I'm only going to touch upon, and I want to speak a little bit about the economic changes that he brought about in the Soviet Union, which I think are key. So at that time, he introduced the concept of a party of the whole people and the state of the whole people, and that it was no longer necessary to have the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm not going to analyze these in detail, but I'll mention them as key changes. He also said it was possible to have a peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, which was always admitted by the founders of socialism, but by way of an exception, when imperialism is armed to the teeth and, as we see, is prepared to commit genocide after genocide around the world in order to maintain its domination and strangulation upon oil wealth, to think of an obvious example, but domination of labor and markets and capital. It's foolish to think that imperialism will give over without a fight when it has such a massive armed machine. We don't need to go into the military expenditure of US imperialism, but it has bought its military supremacy for a reason, and it will not go without a fight, I think. So the idea of peaceful coexistence with imperialism was itself put to the test by the Cuban Missile Crisis and shown, I think, not to be a correct analysis. There was a thorough purge of the Soviet Union party of leadership of some of its top communist members at that time, and there was a growth of private enterprise and the beginnings of a new bourgeoisie. I want to read a very small quote from Engels. I hope the translators are able to keep pace with my presentation, but time is short, I'm sorry. So in modern history, Engels said, all political struggles are class struggles, and all class struggles for emancipation, despite their necessarily political form, turn ultimately on the question of economic emancipation, and therefore here at least the state, the political order, is the subordinate, and civil society, the realm of economic relations, is the decisive element. I've mentioned that capitalism is in a profound crisis of overproduction, and fully 150 years ago, Marxism has pointed out this crisis of overproduction as being a recurring theme of capitalism. And then again, in the words of Engels, in his beautiful book on Ludwig Feuerbach, he says, overproduction and mass misery, each the cause of the other. That is the absurd contradiction of capitalism, which of necessity calls for the liberation of the productive forces by means of a change in the mode of production. And that change in the mode of production is precisely the solution of the contradiction that capitalists has brought forward tremendously powerful means of production which can almost limitlessly expand production. But by resting in the hands, as you all know, in the hands of a tiny number of people, they impoverish the vast masses of the people who ultimately have to form the market to absorb those goods. And if their actual, needs backed by money, their apparent demand is so small that they can't absorb the goods, we're in that absurd situation where capitalism piles up surplus stock whilst the people are starving, whilst the people are hungry, whilst half the world's population live on $1 or $2 a day. 62 people in this world have the same amount of wealth as half the world's population. And it's a classic crisis of overproduction as described by Marx and Engels and indeed Lenin that we're facing in the world today, which is precisely why the leadership of the international communist movement is so very urgently needed. Stalin said in his Economic Problems of Socialism that the market is a heritage of capitalism and it's one of the functions of socialism to abolish it, for commodity circulation is incompatible with the prospective transition from socialism to communism. And yet contradictions don't grow into antagonisms, and that there's no chance of matters coming into a conflict between the relations of production and the productive forces of society. The task, therefore, is to promptly discern incipient contradictions and take timely measures to resolve them by adapting relations of production to the growth of the productive forces. And this, above all, concerns such economic factors as group or collective farm property and commodity circulation. To summarize the 3 points that Stalin thought was necessary to go forward from a planned socialist economy as it stood in the Soviet Union towards communism rather than back towards capitalism, he said, we need to continuously expand all social production, so increase production so there's, as Marx classically described, enough goods to satisfy the wants of humanity. To raise, he said, specifically collective farm property to the level of public property. So actually to turn collective farms into state farms, so that even in the countryside, employees became state employees, and both the means of production and their product was the product of the state, and therefore true rational planning of the economy could take place at a national level. In that case, you'd be able to replace commodity circulation by a system of products exchange, which is perfectly feasible. And if you see large companies, the way in which they are able to manage enormous enterprises, actually on the basis of relatively rational planning, but the breakdown comes between different monopolies where they all have to interact with each other via the market, and there chaos still remains the active factor in capitalist production, no matter how large the monopolies become. And then a substantial advance in the cultural standard of society, and he pointed to a shortening of the working day to 6 and 5 hours, universal compulsory polytechnic education so that you elevate the consciousness of the masses and their ability to administrate society, improve housing conditions radically, and improve wages of employees. Rather than this, after the 20th and the 22nd Party Congresses, Khrushchev adapted measures which moved things in the direction of market socialism, citing, of course, the new economic policy, which was a period of more prices rose, and differences between mental and physical labour were compounded. There was increased income disparity, and in fact a rapid parallel development of private enterprise, with the consequent corruption of the party ideologically and to some point economically. Stalin himself said what was needed was to restrict the sphere of commodity production and the operation of the law of value.